So on transgender contradictions, if gender identity is innate and immutable, let me just stop. What does that mean? Okay, do you all hear that? I mean, when we say that something's immutable, of course, that's one of God's attributes. And that means that God doesn't change. Okay? And so if gender identity is innate, that means, you're born this way, and it is immutable. Now, is that true? Okay, why is that not? Why would you say that? Somebody said it's not true. Why would you say it's not true based upon what we looked at even last week? Okay, yes. Also, though, we said last week that of children who identify as transgender, now this is a brute fact. Do you know what a brute fact is? It's the fact that it doesn't matter whether you're a conservative or a liberal. You got to agree on this because the fact is the fact. 80 to 95% of children who identify as transgender will grow out of it. Okay? So transgender ideology says that it's innate and it's immutable. So if you're this way, and you cannot change. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, the facts don't agree with that. And facts are stubborn things, if you think about it. Because the studies tell us that 80 to 95% of children will grow out of a transgender identity unless, and here's the big unless, and this is where the culture is pushing, and so it's so dangerous, as they're affirmed in that identity, of course, it's more likely they're going to stay with that identity. Okay? So, if gender identity is innate and immutable, how can it be fluid? Okay, there's the fill in, the word fluid. So, these are contradictory ideas. And the law of non-contradiction is one of the laws that you cannot fight against. A and B cannot be the same thing in the same relationship. Okay? You cannot be, in terms of your gender identity, it cannot be immutable and fluid at the same time and in the same relationship. This is nonsense. But our culture has accepted nonsense and said that it makes sense. And all you can do with that is you can say it makes sense, but it's still nonsense. If 80 to 95% of children will grow out of transgenderism, then it cannot be that this is an immutable condition. It cannot be immutable and fluid at the same time, and yet that's what we're told. The second fill-in, why should subjective feelings determine reality? Okay, I heard a uh-huh. You want to elaborate on that?
Subjective feelings. Well, I feel like I'm 110 pounds and green, but that doesn't make it true.
Do you feel like you're green? Yes, I get the point. Why should feeling like a man, and by the way, what does that mean? Shania Twain's, I've heard her song, right? It's old now, but I feel like a woman. I don't feel like a woman, by the way, but what does that mean exactly? Honestly, I'm sincerely asking the question, what does that mean? That I feel like a man or I feel like a woman? I'm not sure what that means. It's very hard to define that. It's very hard to define feelings in general, right? When we start making decisions as a culture for what is true based on what I feel, that's a dangerous place to be.
Doesn't the Bible tell us not to go by our feelings, to go like that?
Well, feelings are not irrelevant. They're important. Affections are important. But I'll tell you, it's a mind-heart connection. So feelings absolutely can lie to us. So at any rate, let me keep reading this. Why should feeling like a man, whatever that means, make someone a man? Why do our feelings determine reality on the question of sex, but on little else? On little else. Our feelings don't determine our age or our height. You know, there was a man a couple years ago who came out, and I'm trying to remember this now, and it just popped into my head. But he was wanting to date younger women, I think. And he was a European. And so he had petitioned what for us maybe would be the county authorities or the state authorities to have his birth certificate changed. He wanted to be like 5 or 6 or 7 years younger. And his rationale was, I feel younger than I am. And so I want that to be stated on my birth certificate, on my driver's license, so that I am younger. So I suppose if he took a younger woman on a date, he could pull out his driver's license and show it to her and say, you see, you're 33 and I'm only 39. When in reality he was more like 49. Now most of us would say, nah, that don't work. But according to the transgender worldview, that does kind of work because feelings determine everything. And so we're just simply asking the question, well, why should that be the case? Can we really live in a world like that? So our feelings don't determine our age or our height. Few people buy into Rachel, I can't pronounce her last name. What's that? Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal's claim to identity as a black woman, since she is clearly not. Now this is in reference to a woman in Spokane who was the regional director for the NAACP, and she was married, I believe she is married to a black man, but she is a white woman. And she did lots of things to change her appearance. You know, she curled up her hair and she darkened her skin in various ways. And she passed as a black woman until her family turned her in and said she's not, and then showed pictures of her as a fair-skinned white woman with, straight hair, and just revealed that it was a total con. Now, of course, the transgender community and everybody else on the other side of this said she feels that she's black, and so we affirm that, and we're going to give her a promotion and let her continue to lead the NAACP in Spokane. Is that what happened? No, she was humiliated, she was forced out, and they said you can't pass. If you're a white woman, you can't pass as a black woman. Well, why not? The transgender folks are now being incredibly unfair, hypocritical. Because again, according to this worldview, it's my feelings that define reality for me. And if my identity, as I've said this a couple times, if I feel like I should be a 6'6" black man with the athletic ability of Michael Jordan.
I feel like I'm 80.
Okay, but that's not reality. So why accept transgender reality? And why not transracial reality? Okay? Or trans-species reality, or trans-abled reality. The challenge for activists is to explain why a person's real sex is determined by inner gender identity, but age and height and race and species are not determined by an inner sense of identity. Okay, that's a challenge. And as a thinking person, I don't see why transgenderism should be accepted until the transgender community can answer those very real questions. And they won't answer those questions. They just act as if those questions are totally irrelevant and they don't matter at all. And that makes me angry, honestly, because I have always despised, above almost anything else, intellectual dishonesty. And this is intellectual dishonesty. And they're wanting to remake culture, and they're telling us that we have to believe what I think are lies, and we all have to just accept this. I just don't see why we should. We're going to skip over the next section because we've talked, I think, a lot about this. So transgenderism and feminism. We'll also skip over the Equality Act, because we've spent a lot of time talking about that as well. I do want to say something, though, about resisting the transgender moment. And I want to read to you a quote from George Orwell, 1984. Any of you read Orwell? 1984, maybe back in high school, or... It's worth reading, it really is. I read it in high school, I've now read it a second time as an adult, and I'd recommend that book, actually. Just listen to these words. Now, Orwell, when did he write 1984? I'm thinking it was after World War II, so it was, I think it was late 40s, early 50s, yeah. It was during the Cold War. And so, yeah, I mean, the circumstances, that's what you need to understand. The Soviet Union, the United States, and those of you who are old enough to remember all that, and totalitarianism as it was expressed by the Soviet Union. That's what Orwell is really primarily responding to. But these words seem so relevant to me. So in 1984, George Orwell describes the pressure to conform to the totalitarian state as follows. So these are his words. It was as though some strange, huge force was pressing down upon you. Something that penetrated inside your skull, battered against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they would make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but also the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. Now, I got to tell you, that sounds so contemporary, particularly with the transgender movement. The heresy of heresies is common sense. So you cannot believe what you know to be true because the ideologues are saying you're wrong. In our time, we do not have an all-powerful state forcing this on us. Not an all-powerful state, okay? But it's a pretty powerful state. It's growing in power. This dictatorship is far more subtle. Under soft totalitarianism, the media, the academic world, corporate America, and other institutions are practicing news speak, that's from Orwell, and compelling the rest of us to engage in doublethink every day. What I'm reading now actually is from Rod Dreher, Live Not by Lies. Men have periods, and the woman standing in front of you is to be called he. Diversity and inclusion means excluding those who object to ideological uniformity. Equity means treating persons unequally, regardless of their skills and achievements, to achieve an ideologically correct result. All right, well, I've got a series of fill-ins here as we close this down. Christians operating out of a Christian worldview must resist the transgender movement for all of the following reasons. Number one, it denies God's creational intent. It really does, doesn't it? I mean, you go back to Genesis 1, 26, 27, God created them male and female. And by the way, I'm preaching from that text today in the sermon. It denies creational intent. Number two, it denies biological realities. It just does. I mean, obviously it does. Sex has always been determined by biological realities, and the transgender movement is saying that doesn't matter at all. That identity, what's between your ears, trumps everything else. Number three, it's fundamentally irrational. And that's what's so difficult about this, right? Because transgenderism is fundamentally irrational. And yet we have a culture filled with people who are willing to think in irrational ways. In many cases, it does not solve the underlying problems faced by those who experience gender dysphoria. Okay, so you've got people in our culture who are confused in terms of their gender identity. Many of them go through the process of transition, including same-sex hormones, ultimately surgical solutions, and then their problem is not fixed. And the literature has story after story after story of this, to where people have been maimed physically, but the underlying depression and anxiety remains. And of course, it is a massive problem because 40% of the transgender community will attempt suicide. It's a very real problem. But if we're not helping people in ways that really bring relief, then we're not helping people. Now, the next one is, it is extraordinarily dangerous for children. Like in so many of these issues we're dealing with, children are the ultimate victims. They really are. Because you've got, in our culture, you've got very young children, again, a brute fact, 80 to 95% of children who have identity struggles will grow out of it if they are affirmed in their biological sex. But if you've got an agenda now pushing those children to accept this gender identity, and you go ahead and put them on hormones, and you begin to mess with their body, I got to tell you, I think that is outrageously irresponsible. But again, we are told to shut up and get with the program. So it's extraordinarily dangerous to children. It's especially harmful to women. I mean, if you're a man in this room, I would say man up, have some masculinity, and recognize that you have a responsibility to protect women and children in our culture, and the transgender movement is hell-bent on doing harm to women and children in our culture. That's a fact. Finally, it denies privacy concerns for virtually everyone, unless you're transgender. And then your rights trump everybody else's rights. All right, I'll stop and just, any thoughts, any comments? If not, we're going to move forward.
John,
Yes.
did you run across any data that said how many children experience?
The percentage, yeah, I don't know. I've heard different things. Of course, and this shouldn't surprise us, the percentages are going up.
Yeah, because it's a thing to do now, but I mean,
Yes.
over the time, I was just curious if they had data that said, a certain percentage of kids kind of experience this. And then you apply the 80 to 90%, I mean, the number gets entirely smaller, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the middle point there, in many cases, does not solve the underlying problem. That's where Christian compassion comes in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually where because we understand that the gospel is the answer to those underlying problems. And I think that's where Christian worldview, that's where, Christians have their compassion.
Yeah, and I don't know how we are perceived. I mean, you might be perceiving me right now as, well, he's the angry white guy. You'd be wrong to perceive me that way. Because if you're not angry about this because it's harming people, there's something wrong with you. I question your moral sanity if you're not angry about this. You should be angry about this. This is harming people. This is not compassionate. It is a lack of compassion to zip your lips and say, this is the way the world's going, and I don't want to get someone angry at me, so I'm just going to go with it. Okay, that's morally cowardly. Okay, that's what that is. I've got it now. I mean, I might be digging a bigger hole if you think that I'm just being mean, but that is honestly how I feel about this. I do have 2 copies of this book, When Harry Became Sally, which I've mentioned the last couple Sundays. Chapter 3, Transitioners Tell Their Stories. If you don't believe me, get the book and read it for yourself. These are people who had their sexual organs cut out of them, and now they have deep regrets because it didn't fix them. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that's true with every situation. I can't say that. What I can say is that it is obscene that we would take small children and begin them on a journey to this. That is obscene. In a secular culture, if you've got Bruce Jenner and he wants to change to Caitlyn Jenner, well, maybe that's Bruce Jenner's choice. He's an adult, he can make a decision for himself. Okay, but there is no way that we should be forcing children down this road when 80 to 95% of them will grow out of this. That's just obscene. So I've got two of these. If you want to read this book, this is the book that Amazon banned, even though this book is written by a PhD level person with degrees from Ivy League schools. It's incredibly well written, it's well researched, it's compassionate. Amazon banned this book for one reason, because this man makes arguments that they cannot refute, and so they don't want to let him speak. So, anyway, it's not a hard read. If you're a kid, a young kid, like Donnie, right? It's Donnie, right? Yeah, he wants to read this book. This might be a stretch for him to read, but just because he's a pretty young person. But your high school student, is he in high school yet, or is he middle school? He's kind of on the borderline, but this is a good book and it's worth reading.
John,
Yeah.
you can get it from Barnes & Noble, and I downloaded and read it this week. One of the faults of the book and Anderson is he's using logic, and we're seeing that logical linear thinking is now being tagged as a white supremacist idea. And you have to really, you cannot deal with this through logic. Because you see, there is no logic to it. One of the best parts of the book is where he asks all those questions, and you kind of alluded to that, where he asks one question after another, including, if it's permanent, why is gender fluid? And he goes through those, and they're wonderful arguments. But if people think that's just a white supremacist way of thinking,
You know how the biggest sign in our culture that you're a racist? Number one sign you're a racist. Well, I was going to say, if someone says you're a racist and you say, no, I'm not a racist, you're absolutely a racist. If you deny being a racist, you're an absolute racist. Is that illogical? Yes. How can you have a conversation? So anyway, that's a different topic. We'll get to that.
I said albinos are the worst.
Yeah, albinos are the worst, yeah. My son Seasai is a black kid, right? He is so angry over so much of the stuff in our culture because he sees it as nobody respects me and my abilities. He sees it as people are treating me like I'm a child, like I can't think for myself, like I can't compete with my own brain in this culture.
That has a term too, they call that the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes.
I mean, that's well described.
that's the highest form of racism.
It is.
In some ways, this whole business has saved Seaside. It's changed him. I don't know.
It's changed him because Seasai is a thinker,
Yes.
and we have many conversations.
I think it's caused him to embrace the gospel, and I just think that in many ways.
It's actually, and it's caused a lot of the pieces of the worldview puzzle of a Christian worldview to begin to click into place in Seasai's brain, because he has been so disgusted by the alternative. And so in that sense, it's actually has been, I think, spiritually very good for Seaside. I'm sorry, Lynn, you've tried to say something several times, and
Black man who said this comment on a news station You have to help us. Quick, help us. We're fine, we can do this, we're very capable.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go into lesson 7. And we'll spend probably a couple weeks with these notes. The Obergefell decision, I'm not going to say anything about that other than to ask you a few questions. What is it and when was it? See, these are things that you need to know, I think. It's like Roe v. Wade. You need to know what that means, and you need to know when that was. I mean, Roe v. Wade was the decision to legalize abortion in the United States. It was a 7-2 Supreme Court decision in 1973. So Obergefell, what is it, when was it? Yeah, it legalized gay marriage in 2015. It was a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court. So Justice Kennedy made gay marriage the law of the land for 330 million people because he was the deciding vote. You know, there was a 4-4 split and Kennedy was in the middle. And so like so many of these decisions that have changed the culture radically, they haven't come about through the democratic process. In other words, through the legislature voting. It's come through the Supreme Court, through judicial activism. But the Obergefell decision in 2015 is where that started. And I would also say that what does it mean to be, it just slipped out of my mind. We've got Republicans, we've got Democrats, and we've got libertarians. There's not a lot of libertarians around, but what's a libertarian?
Less government, more freedom.
Yeah, their mantra is liberty, right? And so they're really hesitant to, law should be the absolute minimum. I am not a libertarian. I do have sympathies with some of their viewpoints. They're the sorts of folks who say that drugs should all be decriminalized because it's an issue of liberty, right? And if I want to use drugs, then I should be able to do that. And when I get on a motorcycle, I shouldn't have to wear a helmet. If I want to go down the interstate, for that matter, maybe there shouldn't be speed laws. I mean, if I want to drive 100 on the interstate, then again, the government's restricting my freedom if they pass a law. What's wrong with that? Maybe you agree with that, but I don't. What's wrong with that?
It's setting rights above responsibility.
It is. That's a better way of stating it than I would have stated it. It's setting rights above responsibilities. Yeah. And it's not acknowledging that there are consequences for that for the rest of us. Are there not? And if you do it the speed limit and some guy exercising his rights crashes into my family's minivan and we're all killed, then, well, that impacted me in a significant way. Or you decriminalize drugs and more people are doing drugs, that impacts all of us. And I'll tell you, one of the things that's radically different when you drive through Portland, I spent a lot of my life living in Portland. And if you wanted to find a homeless person in Portland, when I was a kid, you went to Burnside. And you'd find a few, and they were called winos. And probably not a kind term, but they were older men, and they were homeless. Now you find homeless people everywhere in Portland. I mean, it's stunning, isn't it? If you drive through that city and you start paying attention underneath all the overpasses, that's not normal. I mean, that has not been the history of the city of Portland, but it is now. And I don't know all the reasons for that, but I suspect that drug use is probably a massive contributor to all of that. And so, you know, people just doing what they want to do, it has impacts upon the rest of us, does it not? And so why I'm pointing this out is because when gay marriage was legalized in the United States, it was really interesting how surveys all of a sudden quickly changed. Whereas homosexuality was considered a sin, and people were opposed to gay marriage, after it became the law of the land, that reversed itself in a remarkably short time span. And what that reminds me of is that laws do have consequences in terms of they do shape how we think and how we live. Now, it works both ways, right? As values change, laws change. But it's also true that laws influence how we think. And this is a good example of that. When same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015, it was astonishing to me to see how public opinion changed so quickly. And so when a moral authority says that something's acceptable, people tend to get in line and submit to that authority figure. And in the United States, government has little respect, correct? I mean, President, Congress, but the Supreme Court still thought rather highly of. It's the one branch that still has some authority, some moral authority, along with the military in our country. And so when they made that decision, it began to change hearts and minds, I think. And I think that's just a very interesting statement about, who we are as people and how impressionable we really are. Okay? So the Obergefell decision changed the country in radical ways. And quite frankly, it's hard to imagine how that can be undone. Because even if, well, anyway, that's a whole different discussion. It is where we're at. All right, I want to say something about the marriage mess. And I got to be honest with you, this starts to, I realize that this gets, I'm now meddling, okay? It's easy to condemn something when it impacts people who are only out there, okay? When you start saying things that impact people in here, it's harder to say and it's harder to hear, isn't it? We got to recognize, though, that we didn't get to gay marriage overnight. There were a lot of hurdles that had to be cleared first. And all those hurdles involved sexual compromise and sexual immorality in our culture. And so here, let me just read this. Actually, I'm quoting Ryan Anderson, the author of that book, because he's written another book called Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, which I think is a fantastically good book. And so he writes, we must face the hard reality that we didn't get into this place without tremendous moral compromise. Okay, there's the fill-in, moral compromise. Ryan Anderson writes, long before there was a debate about same-sex anything, far too many heterosexuals bought into a liberal ideology about sexuality that makes a mess of marriage. Cohabitation, no-fault divorce, extramarital sex, non-marital childbearing, pornography, and the hookup culture all contributed to the breakdown of the marriage culture. Do you agree with that statement? Yeah, it's like I was at a track meet on Friday over in Pendleton, and they put the hurdles up. And so you watch the boys and the girls, and they're running those hurdles, and you got to clear those hurdles. Well, all these issues here were like hurdles, and same-sex marriage was the last hurdle. You would never have got to that hurdle without clearing the other ones first. They were roadblocks, but they fell over the decades, one after another. And as they fell, the moral revolution simply advanced to the next step. And so we're in this situation today because of moral compromise that extends really across the entire nation and into church culture as well. Okay? So that is not, I'm not meaning to just bash anybody today. I'm not meaning to create guilt for anybody. We're all sinners saved by grace. But I do think that the other side has a very hard time listening to us or hearing from us when they're able to say, take the log out of your own eye before you try to take the speck out of ours. And I think they've got some moral ground that they can push back on with this. Because it's really easy for churches to say, we are so opposed to gay marriage, but we have basically excused so many other things within our own context. And we've got to a point where for a pastor to say that sexual immorality is sexual immorality, there's a lot of churches where that just isn't said anymore. And so if we're going to try to explain how we got to this place, we've got to recognize that we all bear responsibility for this. So the American church also shares responsibility. The advent of so-called gay marriage in the United States has hopefully caused many churches to examine their marriage practices to ensure that God's standard is more fully honored. That certainly happened here. And so I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have policies in this church. For Stanfield Baptist Church, this means that we will not officiate or participate in the following marriages. Number one, we will not marry a believer and an unbeliever. Number two, we will not marry a man or a woman who are living together. Now, what we will do is try to work with them. And we'll say things like, we will find you a spare bed. Your marriage is 3 or 4 months away. We'll create a situation where the two of you can separate until you're married. Because we're pro-marriage, right? But we're also trying to do it God's way. And we realize if we say we will not officiate a same-sex marriage, but we will officiate marriages between men and women who are living together, what is that? That is hypocrisy. Pure and simple. And we just can't do this. We will not marry couples where one or both have been divorced unless they have biblical grounds for remarriage. And I believe there are biblical grounds. And so you have to look at each of those situations and work through those situations. And then fourthly, of course, we will not marry same-sex couples. So, but we're just trying to acknowledge that if the church is going to be the church, then we have to be consistent and we have to submit to God's word on all of these issues. Okay? Any thoughts on that? It's got kind of quiet in here.
Easy to find. Well, you were saying earlier, it's easy to go emotionally to the point of saying gay marriage or homosexuality is wrong, because that's from an emotional standpoint, it's very easy to see that's this way over here. It's much more difficult for where you're going, John, saying if you're same-sex couple living together, that is sexual sin just like homosexuality. And it's easy for us to push that emotion into the center instead of really working on what is the physical definition of sexual conversion or sexual misconduct and work that into, that's where we're at. And that's what we found in the Constitution, that's what you're reading. What defines as sexual sin, and let's see what we do to push that out.
Mm-hmm. And to try to do that where you're balancing truth and love, and you're really trying to love couples, but you're wanting them to enter into marriage God's way, and to do so without guilt and without shame. So, you know, if they'll submit to God in this, then it'll be for their benefit.
Well, the other thought there is that, I have 6 granddaughters, and, some of them talk about when they get married and whatnot, but, that's something that I wonder if we really teach our children why do you need to marry a Christian and not just somebody that claims to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I've watched many marriages that, the guy is a believer, so they say, but after the marriage is over, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And how important that is. If you're going to have a godly marriage, you need to make sure that you understand that the person you're marrying needs to be a Christ follower before they get married, so that they will be one after they get married. And it's has nothing to do with all of this, really. I mean, it's so crucial that we train our children in what are you looking for in a mate, and to trust God that, I'm going to live my life for God, and if He so chooses to bring somebody into my life, great. If not, that's, the only thing worse than not being married is being married to the wrong person. So I think that's really crucial. It has something to do with this, because there's a different side of that as well.
Yeah, and so all this underlies the importance, I think, of parents being parents and fathers being fathers and being a spiritual leader in your home. And so just to build on this a little bit, when my firstborn Nathan came of age and he started noticing girls, I'm sure he started noticing girls several years before he really confessed it, because he's shy that way. But he took a real interest in a young lady, and I won't tell you her name, but she's LDS. And really nice gal. She was in our home a bit, and I liked her. But I also realized that she's not Christian. Now that might be a controversial subject, but it shouldn't be. LDS, they're not Christian. I mean, their theology is too far away to be considered Christian in an orthodox sense. I'm talking about the Mormons. Okay? So, they get Trinity wrong, they get Christ wrong, they get Scripture wrong, they get salvation wrong. Those are the 4 things to join this church. We examine you on these things. You must understand and affirm the Trinity, the dual natures of Christ, the authority of the Bible, and justification by faith alone. Mormonism denies all 4 of those. And I hear people say, well, they're Christians. No, they're not. Not in any orthodox sense. Theology doesn't matter to you if you say that. Okay? So what happened is that I said to Nathan and this young girl, we need to have a talk. And I remember this. We went down into my basement. And I just led a conversation. And I said, okay, you two are clearly, romantically, you're getting connected to one another. And you need to understand that your theological positions are simply not compatible. And we talked through all of that. And both of them came to the decision that this isn't going to work, because neither were going to give. And it wasn't long after that until Molly Golter called up, my wife, and said, there's this girl in Pendleton, her name's Sierra, and I just think that maybe Nathan or her would be a good fit. And that worked out. Now, so Nathan's married a solid Christian gal. Here a few weeks ago, my son Sisai, who's not here today, but if he were here I'd say this, he took an interest in a young lady. And he met her. I won't get into all the details of this, but I think he thought she's probably a believer. Well, it turns out she's not. Very secular gal. But you could tell that Sisai liked her. And he's had a lot of opportunities to like girls. And this one was different. It really was. You could just tell it almost immediately. And I was worried about this. And Sisai is, he's an interesting parenting dynamic there. But we were talking with him, Maria and I, and praying for him. But I did tell him, I said, Sisai, and this is very early on in this potential relationship, I said, Sisai, you need to understand that if you were to marry this person, I would not marry you. I just put that out there. I said, I could not marry you because she is not a believer. And the Bible's opposed to that. That's what's, we cannot be unequally yoked. And he commented, he said, I thought that's what you'd say to me. At any rate, he ended it. And I didn't force him to end it. I can't force Sisai to do much of anything, honestly. But he was able to think through this, and he had some conversations with this young person, and I think he realized she is not going in the same direction that I'm going in life. And he ended it. And so pray for Sisai that God will, bring some godly young woman into his life. But I think we need to have those conversations. And they might be uncomfortable at times, but, you've got to talk into the lives of your sons and your daughters, and you've got to realize that you have more influence than you probably realize that you have. So, all right. Okay, well, we'll go on a little bit farther here. Is opposition to gay marriage equivalent to racism? Because you hear that a lot, don't you? I mean, I think that's kind of the number one thing that pressures people like me and hopefully like you who have an issue with this. You're being homophobic, which is it's like racist. You're being a racist. You're being a hater. And so, can we push back against that? I think we can. Well, how do we do that? Again, it's hard because we're living in a culture where logic is just sort of dismissed, as Marilyn pointed out. But for years, the refrain of the left has been that people who oppose same-sex marriage are just like people who opposed interracial marriage. Okay? And that the law should treat them just as it treats racists. This analogy should be rejected for at least two reasons. And there might be many more, but these are, to me, the most significant two. Number one, race does not involve morally significant behavior. Okay? Race does not involve morally significant behavior. I'll ask you a real basic question. Is sexual expression morally significant? I mean, I think everyone will say yes to that at some level. They might not agree on particular examples, but at some point they will say, yes, this is morally significant behavior. Okay, so there is a fundamental difference here, and to me, again, it's so bankrupt, intellectually speaking, to deny the fundamental difference here. That the color of your skin is not morally significant. But what you do sexually with your body is morally significant. So the analogy, many arguments are made, it's the argument by way of analogy. This is like that. Well, this is a bad argument by analogy because this is not like that. Okay? But these things pass, and people give it a pass, and we shouldn't give it a pass. So if you're talking with people about these issues, I don't think it's wrong to say that. And to just be firm and forward and say, I do not accept that sexual behavior is morally insignificant. It's a bad argument. And then second of all, marriage serves a higher purpose than romantic fulfillment. Okay, so the fill in there is the word romantic. Marriage serves a higher purpose than romantic fulfillment. And we're going to spend a lot more time with that argument, actually with both of these, next Sunday. And so we're going to really come back to that. I'm going to explain more fully what that means. But let me again quote Anderson. Race has nothing to do with marriage, but marriage has everything to do with uniting the two halves of humanity, men and women, as husbands and wives and as mothers and fathers, committed to any children they bring into the world. So while marriage must be colorblind, it cannot be blind to sex. The melanin content of a person's skin has nothing to do with his capacity to unite with another in the bond of marriage as a comprehensive union naturally ordered for procreation. The sexual difference between a man and a woman, however, is at the heart of marriage. Men and women, whatever their race, can unite in marriage. Children, whatever their race, deserve a mom and a dad, their own mom and dad, whenever possible. Now that last statement is getting at this point that marriage serves a higher purpose than romantic fulfillment. Marriage is for the continuation of the human race, and marriage is for the establishing of a community that is best suited for the flourishing of children.
So if the purpose of marriage is to procreate, then would it be sinful to decide against having children?
Boy, that is a good question.
Can you repeat it?
The question is, can you speak it louder?
Yeah, I said, if the purpose of marriage is to procreate, then would it be sinful to decide against having
That is a very good question. And it has to have a nuanced answer. Marriage is not only about procreation. There are other purposes to marriage. And so, for instance, if you are married and for whatever reason are unable to procreate because there's a biological issue here and you know, your wife is unable to conceive, she's unable, your marriage does not produce children, okay? You should not for a moment think that my marriage was somehow not a marriage or a lesser marriage or a failure as a marriage or any of those thoughts, because that is a reality. I don't know the percentage, but you know, there are men and women who get married who are unable to have children. They're still fully married and honorable in the sight of God. I think there are other situations where someone could conceivably, for the sake of the kingdom of God, say, we're not going to have kids. For instance, a man and a woman get married and they say, we're going to spend our lives in an incredibly hostile environment where Christianity is despised and rejected, and if we're arrested, we could lose our lives. There are places like that in this world. And there are men and women, these are real scenarios where they have chosen not to have children because they have said, we're going to give our lives to this mission field, and we believe it would be too dangerous to bring children into that environment. So I think there are situations where a person, for right God-honoring reasons, could say, we're not going to produce offspring. But I think those would be the exceptional situations, for sure, that God has ordered marriage as a primary purpose to produce offspring and then to have the environment where those children are most likely to flourish. Okay, so that's the heart of this argument. Now, we realize that this argument, we realize that we're living in a world where lots of families don't have what's being described here, right? Because families are broken in various ways. And so, you know, parents do the best they can in circumstances that are not ideal, because it's a broken world. What this argument is making, though, is that we should not intentionally break it and then bring kids into that. Does that make sense? So as an example, imagine you've got two women and they're married and they want to have children. Okay? And there's a maternal instinct, right? I mean, women want to have children. And so they accomplish that by a sperm donor. And so one of them has a baby. This argument is saying that that is fundamentally unfair to that child, because that child deserves to have a father. And that child, because of the romantic desires of those two women, marriage has been defined as only romantic desire, and so now children become accessories to this couple and their happiness. So we're going to accessorize our marriage by producing some children in a not normal biological way. And there are many instances of children growing up and having, you know, there's something called like a father wound, where a child grows up, even from, you know, a child adopted from the cradle, from birth, and there's still this woundedness within them because the biological parent isn't there. So to actually have a policy where you create this brokenness is not putting children's interests first. So in that scenario, you've got this child. So these two women have a child, a boy or a girl, and that child will never know his or her biological father and never have a relationship with his or her biological father. And there are things that fathers bring and that mothers bring that benefit children. And so to create an institution called gay marriage where you are going to have that kind of brokenness, kids again become the victims, and they become the victims in almost all of this. Okay?
So here's kind of the, I can understand we're not going to create a child without mother, father. So what would you say to the argument of a same-sex married couple who can provide a stable home and love to a child, say in a foster home that's being tossed from home to home to home? How would you answer that? Because I can see the point, that would it be better to have two dads than nobody? I mean, I'm not.
Is that really,
I agree with that.
is that really the situation though? And I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Are there situations where, I mean, I guess I would say the church should stand up. The church should stand up so that that's never necessary. I guess that would be my response.
I think that's a good response.
One of the
Supporting
mysteries of
that.
marriage is that from the beginning of history, and this is a secular statement, from the beginning of history and across all cultures, marriage is a standard. Now, sometimes it's where you have 3 or 4 wives or things like that. But the point is marriage between a man and a woman is standard in all cultures because it provides order to that culture. And I think, of course, we know that it comes from God's original commandment and it's spread around. But if you're a secularist, marriage is a form of orderliness. And when you begin to mess with that particular standard, your culture starts to break down.
Yeah.
And you can't get away from that, whether you know this is God's ordinance or whether you don't believe it is.
Yeah, and so this second argument has really, you don't have to be a religious person to make this argument at all. You can say, as you've just said, and I think it's right, our culture is extraordinarily arrogant to have taken the wisdom of all of human history and just in a number of years thrown all of it in the trash can. Because every culture has ordered marriage for the benefit of children. And here we come along and say, every culture throughout all of human history has done it wrong. How arrogant is that? That's extraordinary. It's unbelievably arrogant. But this is an argument that just is saying that it's not against gay relationships. A person could hold this argument and say if 2 men or 2 women want to have a sexual relationship, more power to them. Let's not call it marriage. Because marriage is about more than romantic fulfillment. It is about establishing healthy families. And for healthy families, the best model for this is clearly a mother and a father who are committed to each other and committed to their children. Because moms and dads bring something to the relationship that children need. Any other thoughts or comments? We need to close for today.
I think the Supreme Court has brought a lot of this on, legalizing things that are against God.
Yeah, there's a lot of blame to go around, I think.
You know, that's
Yeah.
nothing to do with this.
And Sam, as we close, I mean, I'm aware that you've grown up in a home with a dad, and your mom's not around much, right? And I don't know all the details of that. And so I'm not wanting to say something bad about your dad or anything like that, right? I mean, I think your dad's probably done a pretty darn good job of trying to be mom and dad, right? You don't know. But the ideal is, mom and dad in the home. That's what we would desire for every kid. So, and we realize in a broken world that sometimes that's not the case, and people do the best they can. Okay? Sorry I hope you're okay with me kind of. Okay. Well, then next time when we continue with this, we're going to look at all the major biblical texts that have to do with homosexual practice. And then we're going to look at these two views of marriage that I've kind of introduced, consent versus conjugal, and talk more fully through those issues. Okay? And so I'm going to make a biblical argument on this next week. You want to know what does the Bible say about this? We're going to look at that. And we'll make arguments from both of those perspectives. All right, we're done for today. So I need some